Hello, this is Michael McCarthy. In this video we're going to take a look at baking hair with Ornatrix. We have a furry character here, and in this scene we're using that furry bat character, which is a sample scene up on our site. So if you want to follow along, you can grab that scene and follow right along with me. We might want to take this hair and bake it down to the underlying texture of the character. And there's a couple of reasons to do this. First reason is potentially you want to use this character and the furry texture of it as an in-game type of character. Maybe it's a background character or something like that where you don't actually need the fluff of the hair. And the ability to bake this hair down to a texture is very attractive in that regard. The second reason is, of course, to have a more detailed texture underneath the character if the character is deforming, or for close-ups where you just don't see a flat texture. So if I take this character and hide the hair, we go ahead and render out, you can see this is what we have for the texture underneath. So for a character like this, maybe a gorilla, a dog, something that is very furry, it's good to have that fur texture underneath the hair that you're rendering out, whether it's volume hair or something in mental ray or V-ray. Now this is certainly true for a furry character like this, but it's also going to be true for any hair scalps or bipedal or human character hair that you would be making. Because for that scalp, it's always a good idea to have a texture of the hair itself underneath as opposed to maybe a skin texture. So this is good to do for, short hair or potentially even long hair on a character as well in order to get that scalp looking good. To get started, the first thing we're going to want to do is grab our character's hair, and we're going to want to prep it for baking. In order to do that, what we're going to do is just add our Mesh from Strands modifier, and that's going to take our hair and it's going to turn it into a mesh. Now there's a couple of settings that you'll want to set here. By default this is actually set to billboards, and you'll want to turn this into cylindrical hair, and that's just to avoid any normal problems or ray misses where it would go through the other side of a flat billboard. You also probably want to go down and make sure that you uncheck the per strands UV coordinates, and that's because we don't really want it per strand. We want to grab the color from underneath so that we get the overall color of that texture that is underneath. Now that we've done that, our hair should look pretty much the same. We have all the same stuff here. It's just going to be rendered as geometry now. And that also gives us the ability, of course, to render our hairs. In the viewport we'll have a certain amount, and in the render we'll actually have a certain amount. So all that mesh will get generated at render time, and it will bake down onto our character, which is what we want. The next thing we want to do is take the character's body and prep that for baking. Now, Render to Texture in Max doesn't really love the reference or instance system that you might be using with Ornatrix. It likes the mesh to just kind of be a simple dumb mesh. So in order to do that, we're just going to take the bat body, go to Tools, and choose Snapshot. You can choose the default, which is just single and mesh, and choose OK. And that's going to give us a bat body 001, which I'm just going to rename quickly to bat body bake. Just going to sort this by name, and I'm going to grab all of these and just change their wire color so I can visually distinguish them and see what I'm doing here. Okay, so now that I've kind of prepped that bat body, I can actually hide it because I'm going to be dealing with the hair, which we made sure was a mesh to bake, and we have our bat body bake. The next thing that we need to prep is the renderer. So right now, or previously, we were rendering this as a volumetric object. So let's go into Environment and Effects. And because it's rendering as geometry now, we don't need the volumetric fast ray tracer from Ornatrix. So I'm going to uncheck that because that won't work with render to texture, and that's a pretty important thing to understand and make sure is off. Now that we've turned that off, Scanline will just render the geometry as it normally would, and that will get baked down onto our character. So with the bat body bake selected, let's press 0 on our keyboard, and that's going to bring up the render to texture dialog. It's also going to load our bat body bake as the object to bake, and we're going to be able to set a couple of settings here for it. I'm going to click on Enable under Projection Mapping, and I'm going to uncheck sub-object levels because that's not something that I need right now. Now, I do want to use a projection modifier, and what I could do is choose this pick option. If I do that and I pick the hair, it'll be kind of slow and it'll give us a little bit of a wonky result. So usually I like to pick this or create this on my own, but I will show you exactly what it does. So I'll go in and pick, and I'm going to pick my bat hair. And you're going to see it's going to take a while to generate because it's trying to go through all these hair objects and it's trying to project a cage based on those hair objects and push it out based on those normals, and that can be kind of tricky for it to do. It also adds the hair object into our objects to bake list, which is good too, and it automatically creates our projection modifier here. You can see what we get. It's probably an undesirable cage just because it has to deal with all those hairs, and it takes a while to generate, which is something that I really don't love. So I'm actually going to just delete this. I would not go through this step and actually just create it manually. So pretty simple to do. We're just going to go and add our projection modifier. And you can see we get a very uniform cage. We can scroll down and just push the cage amount out, and that's going to be plenty in order to encompass our character's fur. Once I'm happy with that cage, I can actually turn it off because I don't need to see that anymore. And I can choose to pick the object that we want to reference or bake. So I'm going to click on pick and I'll pick our hair. So now bat hair will be loaded in there. Now if I go over here, this is refreshed, and I can choose that projection modifier in our projection mapping setup. Now there are some options in here that I might want to change, and we'll look at those a little bit later. But next I want to move on to mapping coordinates and output. So for the mapping coordinates, you just need to make sure that you have the correct mapping coordinates chosen as far as the unwrapped character. So the character's texture is actually unwrapped on channel 1, and this is the UV channel that you're using. It's important to pick that so it knows which channel to bake. Most of the time if you just have one unwrapped channel, that's all you're going to have here, and that's going to be set up by default. But in our case we used a couple of other channels in order to groom our hair, and if you want to know more about that you can take a look at the Furry Bat video that kind of walks you through that. In our case though, the UVs are baked onto, or the UVs for where we want to bake to are in channel 1. So now we can choose our output and we can choose the maps we want. I'm going to go in and choose a complete map, and I'm going to make that 1024 by 1024. You can choose a higher or lower resolution depending on your needs. I'm also going to go in and choose a normal map, and I'll set the resolution of that to 1024. And I'm just going to check this option at the bottom to output into normal bump. And what that's going to do is instead of just putting it into the bump map, it's going to create the normal bump kind of shell map, and that's going to interpolate the normals properly for us. And that's pretty much all we need to do in order to render this character out. So let's go and click on render. And you can see that that has gone through, and we have our nice hair texture baked down, which is exactly what we want. So the last thing I'm going to do is go into options. You may want to go in and change kind of the anti-aliasing that's going on here. So for scanline, we can go in and under global super sampler choose setup, and under super sampling we can say enable global super sampler, and we can choose the max 2.5 star or one of the other super samplers that are there and close that out. So now when we render out, we'll get something that is much smoother as it goes through. So let's click on render, and you can see as this goes through here, we're going to have a much smoother and anti-aliased result, which is going to be good. It doesn't take that much longer, and of course we only really have to bake this once, so may as well spend a little bit of time making sure that our texture looks nice. Okay, so we've completed baking our character. Let's just close out of render the texture for now. We can go in and we can hide our hair, and we can select the bat body bake and bring up our material. Now this is going to put our material into a shell material, which is the default and what we asked it to do. We can go into our viewport material, and I'd recommend changing the display to show realistic material in viewport. And you can see that show up there in the viewport now. If I go into my diffuse map and click on view, you can see we have our nicely baked diffuse map with its hair. And if I go into our maps, choose normal bump, you can see our normal map will be in there, and there's the normal map that got baked out. So now when we go in and render, you may want to just adjust the bump a little bit. So I'm going to bring that back down to maybe the default of 30 or 40. And it looks a little bit better. We're also going to have to go back and actually set this to be the render version here. So there you can see that we render through and you have that nice hair texture all the way throughout, suitable for, maybe a background game character, or certainly to be underneath the hair that is already getting generated. So now what we could do is go over here, turn our hair back on, and if we want to re-render out our volumetric hair on top of this, we'll just turn off our Mesh from Strands modifier. We'll go into our environment and turn back on our fast ray tracing and click render again. And there's our hair rendering through, and we have our baked texture underneath. So if we had some close-ups or some deformation that kind of showed the texture underneath, then we'd have that nice rich texture to support our hair object. So that's the basic workflow with baking in our hair to a texture using render texture in Ornatrix in 3ds Max. If you want to do this for game output or broadcast or film, this is how you go about it, and hopefully we're able to improve your production workflow by going through these steps. The next thing we're going to look at is how to set this up in Mental Ray. There's a couple of small things that need to be changed around. Of course, we still be using the mesh and render to texture, but there's a couple of things we would need to change about our render settings, our materials, and our lights in order to get that proper setup for Mental Ray. So we're going to take a look at that in our next video. Thank you very much.